Hello everyone, welcome back to class. Today we are continuing on in our first unit by looking at various ethical theories that underlie bioethics in Western society. I'm going to begin today by offering kind of a brief recap of what we've looked at in Module 1, and then we're going to continue on by looking at two more ethical theories today that influence the practice of bioethics in clinical settings. Last time we talked about how bioethics is informed by a number of fields, disciplines, and movements within Western history and philosophy. That is, I tried to argue that bioethics is informed by Enlightenment values, the scientific method, and both classical and modern philosophy. Recall what we said about the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a period in European history, we can say maybe the 17th century through the 18th century, where thinkers of this time period were relying on reason in order to make sense of the world around them and to try to answer humanity's basic questions. Thus, this period saw an explosion of knowledge and technical fields such as engineering, anatomy, chemistry, physics, philosophy, architecture, etc. What kind of characterized this period in human history was the prioritization and application of reason above faith and the use of the scientific method to trying to figure out how the universe works and why. It was during this period that we, again, saw an explosion of knowledge in these different fields, as well as the emergence of social and political theory today that underlies Western society, which we call democratic liberalism or classical liberalism. This was pioneered by thinkers like John Locke and John Stuart Mill. And it underlies a lot of our political theory and practice today, for example, in the US. Bioethics is also informed by the scientific method. Last time we talked about how the inventions that were coming out of science and the knowledge that was coming out of applying the scientific method was a really influential part of medicine and the creation of the medical field during this time. Unsurprisingly, people discovered that if they formed some sort of hypothesis, engaged in some sort of experiment, used their observations to see what happened in the experiment, and then compared the results of the experiment with their hypothesis and completed this method, that they were able to figure out a lot of things about how the universe works. Thus, the application of the scientific method ended up helping humans a lot in figuring out what the hell is all this stuff around us and how it works. Unsurprisingly then, in the field of bioethics, which is a practical discipline, we would also expect to see the practice being influenced by this idea that there is an objective truth to be discovered and some sort of objective standard of applying reason to problems. So, bioethics is informed by both Enlightenment values and the scientific method. Finally, we talked about how bioethics is informed by both classical and modern philosophy. Two of the views that we looked at, two of the ethical theories that underlie bioethics today, were Aristotle's virtue theory and Aquinas' natural law theory. Let me just summarize these again. Aristotle's virtue theory argued that in order to live a happy, healthy, fulfilled life, that involves engaging in a certain life of activity in which we cultivate the virtues, or tendencies or dispositions in order to react appropriately to the situations that life throws at us and that utilize our capacities in excellent ways. In other words, in his view, Aristotle was trying to encourage humans to engage in radical self-improvement so that they could become the wisest, most knowledgeable, most moral people that they could be. And he thought that if we trudge down this path of self-improvement, that we would be able to live a life of happiness and fulfillment. That was in line with what is objectively good for us as human beings. Building off of this view, during the Middle Ages, Aquinas, who has strongly influenced Catholic theology and Catholic healthcare, took Aristotle's view and ran with it. He combined Aristotle's virtue theory with Christian philosophy and came up with a view known today as natural law theory. On this view, Aquinas argued that if we want to live a happy, moral, fulfilled life, what that involves is basically following the will of God and prioritizing, in some sense, spiritual affairs and our spiritual health over mere earthly affairs. So Aquinas argued that if we want to be fulfilled moral people, we should seek to live and act in our lives the way that God lives and acts, how he rules over the universe. And that the model that we can follow for this kind of life is Jesus Christ, God made flesh incarnate on earth. These are two classical and medieval ethical theories that underlie bioethics today. But last module, we also looked at some modern ethical views that inform bioethics. These were Kant's deontological view and Mill's utilitarian view. Kant argued that we have certain duties that we ought to perform for ourselves, for others, and possibly for God as well. Recall, he argued that morality is intimately connected with rationality, and that there is an objective standard of right and wrong that we are beholden to, that we can discover through the application of reason. He gave us two tests to try to figure out whether or not we are going to be able to perform a moral action in a given circumstance. First, we see if we can universalize our action or our principle. We ask, can everybody do what I'm about to do? And would it be possible for there to exist such a world in which everybody had to act this way? If our principle or maxim can be universalized, then we can rely on it for moral actions. But if it can't be universalized, then we know that it's not always going to allow us to do moral things. The second formulation or test that he offered us to see whether or not an action is moral or immoral is reflecting on whether or not we are about to treat the person as a mere object. See, Kant thought that human beings have some sort of intrinsic value or worth that ought to be respected. They have their own desires and will. And so what it means to be a moral person is to act with the appropriate principles, or from the right intention, we might say, and to try to make sure that we're doing what we're doing just because we recognize that it is the right thing to do, not to get anything out of the action. We're not doing it for some personal goal or reward. That was basically Kant's deontology. In contrast to that view, we looked at Mill's utilitarianism, which argued that it's not one's will or principles that determine the morality of an action, it's actually the consequences. So utilitarianism argues that if we want to do moral things, we need to do those things that produce the best consequences for the most amount of people. In other words, we should try to maximize happiness in the universe through our actions. It was these ethical theories that we looked at last time. Today, we're going to look at two more ethical theories that contemporary bioethics is based on. I asked you to read Chapter 2 of Principles of Biomedical Ethics, And it is within this chapter that the authors discuss the ethical theories of liberal individualism and community-based ethics. So today we're going to talk about how these two theories influence bioethics, and in the next lecture, part 2 on this chapter, we're going to look at how the ethics of care and casuistry inform bioethics. Okay, let's get started. The first ethical theory I'd like to investigate today is known as liberal individualism, or rights-based theory. According to this framework, patients, doctors, and care teams have certain rights that ought to be respected in the practice of healthcare. Things like the right to life, the right to practice the religion of one's own choosing, the right to informed consent, etc. The basic idea is this. In virtue of being humans and living in the kind of society in which we live, individuals have certain rights that ought to be respected. And these rights are of primary concern when we're trying to decide what treatment somebody should undergo or whether or not to go through with a certain practice. The authors note that since the writings of Thomas Hobbes, a titan in Western political philosophy, reference to human rights has been used to, quote, buttress moral and political arguments. So for centuries, this idea has been floating around that individuals, in virtue of their humanity, have some sort of rights that ought to be respected, and that these rights perhaps trump some other things that we might like to engage in society. We can define rights as follows. Quote, justified claims that individuals and groups can make upon others or upon society. So the idea is basically that in virtue of having certain rights, that makes it so that other people in society have to treat us a certain way and that we have to treat them a certain way. Rights grant us and others certain moral and political responsibilities. And you might say obligations as well, depending on the nature of the right. We might distinguish between two different kinds of rights. See, when we talk about rights, our language tends to be a little bit muddied. People end up talking about things like legal rights and things like moral rights. The problem is that these two things are not the same. So when we talk about rights in this class, I'm going to recommend that you only use that terminology in the context of the rights that are granted to us politically. In the text, the authors distinguish legal rights, which are justified by laws, legal principles and rules, from moral rights, which are justified by moral principles and rules. But what liberal individualism is based on is primarily legal rights. This idea that we have certain rights that ought not to be violated in virtue of the kind of creature that we are. Obviously, according to this view, individuals have rights even if they can't express them. So, for example, if somebody is comatose and in the hospital or in some vegetative state, we still say that they have certain rights that ought to be respected, even if they can't express those rights or try to advocate for some treatment on their own behalf. These rights are not dependent on people having the ability to express them or to advocate for themselves. Individuals simply have rights. This is taken as a given in our society, and one of the presuppositions that liberal individualism is based on. There are two different kinds of rights that the text makes a distinction between. What are called positive rights and negative rights. Positive rights are rights to be provided with a particular good or service by others. Negative rights are basically associated with the right to be free from some action taken by others. So let me give you a few examples to help make this clear. When somebody says in a conversation that healthcare is a human right, what they're trying to say is that in virtue of us being human, we should be provided with healthcare just because we are human. Our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence also gives us other positive rights. That is, it says that in virtue of being human, we are afforded certain goods or services. These things just ought to be given to us. For example, like due process and representation in a trial. These are the things that are afforded to us in our founding political documents. Just in virtue of being a human, we have a right to a fair trial. That is something we are given. It's something that society is obligated to give us. And we have a right to legal representation. That is something that is afforded to us, that we feel like society needs to give us, that they have an obligation to give us. So those are positive rights. A positive right is the right to be provided with a particular good or service by others. It places an obligation on others to do something. Negative rights are the right to be free from some action taken by others. That is, it places an obligation on others to refrain from doing something to us. For example, a negative right would be the right to bear arms. The Second Amendment. This is a negative right because we don't believe that the government has an obligation to provide us with guns, but we do believe that we have the right to own and wield arms. That is, we have a right not to have our guns taken away from us. That would be an example of a negative right. It places an obligation on the government or other people to refrain doing something to us. Refusal of medical treatment would also be an example of a negative right. We have a right to basically refrain or have someone refrain from doing some sort of medical procedure to us. That is within our rights as people who live in our democratic society. So, the primary distinction between positive rights and negative rights are that positive rights provide us with a particular good or service. Negative rights make it so that we are free from some action taken by others. It places some sort of obligation on other people to refrain from doing something to us. Now, this conversation ends up getting a little bit tricky, and liberal individualism within the field of healthcare and bioethics gets a little bit muddied because people oftentimes talk about rights and moral obligations as if they're interchangeable. People will say, for example, that, oh, healthcare is a basic human right, or she has a right to expect that from her doctor. These kinds of phrases are a little bit misleading. Our Constitution in the U.S., for example, does not grant us the positive right to healthcare. What people seem to mean by this phrase is that we have a moral obligation to provide healthcare to people, and that is a good thing. And that's something that we should expect as humans, because we have the resources and money to be able to do so. When somebody says, oh, she has a right to expect good treatment from her doctor, what they're saying is we have some sort of justified expectation or it makes sense that there is some sort of moral obligation that we be treated right by healthcare practitioners. That is, people mix up the language of political rights and moral obligations all the time. So in our discussion posts, in our lectures about this kind of stuff, in our exploration of all these issues, we should try to be as precise in our language as we can. So I'm going to encourage you, when you're talking about this stuff in your writings, in your investigations, your essays, try to reserve the word rights for those positive and negative rights that are granted to us by our founding political documents. If you plan on talking about some sort of moral obligation, use that phrase instead. We want to try to avoid confusing our readers or confusing each other as we talk about some of the difficult topics that we're going to get into in this class. Okay, so that was a little tangent. Let me now just summarize this view. Liberal individualism is one ethical theory that underlies bioethics today. If we were to define it, we could say liberal individualism is the view that the morality of an action is dependent on whether the action respects and promotes an individual's rights, and that these rights are prior to other concerns and considerations. So, if somebody is particularly influenced by liberal individualism, what they're going to say is that people have certain political rights that are afforded to them. Respecting these rights is paramount. So, that means before we look into or consider anything else, we need to make sure that we are respecting this person's rights, that we're not violating somebody's rights. And you can see how this informs the practice of healthcare today and why this is important. So many of the discussions that we have in clinical settings are about what the patient has a right to and respecting patient autonomy. When we get to looking at the 4 principles of biomedical ethics specifically, we'll see how this liberal individualistic view informs one of the central pillars of medical practice today. In the meantime, just remember that this idea that humans have rights that ought to be respected is incredibly important in how individuals are treated in healthcare settings, in what guides clinical practice. We might say that this emphasis on rights in bioethics falls out of the classical liberal political philosophy on which our society is based. Just think back to what the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence says. It argues that humans have certain inalienable rights that ought not be violated, such as the right to life, liberty, and, quote, the pursuit of happiness, unquote, right? So our very society is built on this idea that as humans we have certain rights. Unsurprisingly then, this pops up also in the field of bioethics. This idea that we can't violate these political rights that people have just in virtue of being human. Now, while this view is incredibly important in healthcare, it has its own problems and weaknesses as an ethical theory. For starters, the authors of this chapter note that rights-based theories fail to offer us a holistic understanding of morality and moral obligations. If you were to engage in medical practice just based on this liberal individualistic view, that wouldn't tell you anything about whether or not somebody's intention influences the morality of an action, whether or not supererogatory acts are good or praiseworthy, what we call in ethics supererogatory acts are those that we don't have an obligation to perform, such as going out of your way for someone, doing something really nice for someone that you don't have to do. That would be an example of a supererogatory act. When we talk about these kinds of things, we think that engaging in those kinds of acts are good and we want to promote those. But according to liberal individualism, which is just focused on safeguarding rights, it doesn't really tell us anything about that. It doesn't really tell us anything about the connection between somebody's intentions and their actions. And it doesn't really tell us why virtues are important or whether they should be cultivated, if we think about Aristotle's view. In other words, rights-based theories might be a good way to justify some medical practice or some sort of treatment, but as an ethical theory alone, it needs some help making sense of these other moral considerations. Rights-based theories also don't really help us answer the question of whether or not an individual should exercise a right. So, for example, let's say that in our society, somebody has the right to bear arms. That is, they have a right such that them owning guns should not be violated by the government or other organizations. That's all well and good, but this does not tell us whether or not an individual should go out and buy guns or use guns, right? All it tells us is that it is inappropriate for someone to steal your guns unjustifiably. And it's the same thing with other rights as well. According to our founding documents, we have all these positive and negative rights, but simply talking about whether or not we have rights or not doesn't tell us when or how we should exercise them. So, as an ethical theory, liberal individualism needs some help in order to provide us an answer to the question of whether or not we should exercise a right or how and when to do so. Finally, the big problem that people have with rights-based theories is that it doesn't seem that respecting individual rights should always take precedence over communal concerns. For example, like public health. In the United States, we tend to prioritize safeguarding these individual liberties, but sometimes we recognize that violating an individual's rights might be a moral or a medical necessity. Take public health, for instance. One of the arguments that was made for mandating the COVID-19 vaccine was on the grounds of public health. You had people on one side of the political aisle saying, "You can't force me to get a vaccine, that violates my right to bodily autonomy." And you had people on the other side of the political aisle saying, well, in most cases we should respect individual autonomy, but sometimes the health of the community or the wider public needs to take precedence over individual rights. So this is a debate that is still being had today. It's not obvious that respecting individual rights is always a good thing or the ethical thing. There are people that argue that sometimes rights need to be infringed upon in order to keep wider society safe, in order to look out for the good of people generally. So, there is always that tension between individual liberties and the affairs of the public. In sum then, liberal individualism is the view that the morality of an action is dependent on whether or not that action respects and promotes an individual's political rights. and that these rights are taken to be prior to other concerns and considerations. This view, like the other ones we've looked at, has its own problems and weaknesses, the primary one being that it needs help from other ethical views in order to provide determinations for what we ought to do in our lives. We can contrast this liberal individualism with what you might call its opposite ethical theory, which is known as communitarianism or community-based theory. See, liberal individualism provides not only a framework for whether or not certain actions are justifiable, but it also provides a kind of story of what it means to be a human in Western society and what our relationships are to one another. Liberal individualism, according to some authors, puts forth the view that humans are autonomous, separate, rational individuals that are all distinct from one another and ought to be respected and seen as individuals in their own right. Communitarianism, firstly, is going to disagree with this view of humanity. It's going to say that humans are not essentially autonomous, separate individuals. Rather, it's going to argue that humans exist in a web of social relations, traditions, relationships, etc. So, communitarianism is going to take the social, it's going to take society as existing before the individual. So individuals are not ultimately separate from the society in which they are born and raised. They are informed by wider society. They get their individual views from their own social upbringing and conditioning. And communitarianism is going to insist on this idea that because we become an individual in society and on account of society, we have certain social and moral obligations to the wider public that override just individual concerns and rights. According to communitarianism, communal values, the common good, social goals, and social solidarity take precedence over individual rights. So the communitarian is going to argue that what should take priority in our decision making and how we live our lives is whether or not we are helping our local community flourish, our family flourish, our wider society flourish. So instead of prioritizing protecting individual rights, communitarianism is going to say we should be taking as our top priority the health of the public in general, not just whether or not my individual rights are being infringed upon. Thus, many proponents of this communitarian view criticize liberalism, the values that it instantiates in society, and the harms that it produces. Communitarians are going to say things like, look at what classical liberalism has done to Western society in the last few centuries. There's poverty, there's inequality, there's inequity between social groups. They're going to say that this focus on individualism, on rights, has produced bad social situations. People fall through the cracks. We don't have robust social systems. People are experiencing pain and suffering. Inequality is exacerbated. So, communitarianism is going to say that this focus on individualism, this focus on rights, has basically created a society in which a lot of people are suffering and they're falling through the cracks. If we want things to change, if we want to help people, we need to start focusing more on communal goals and communal health rather than individual concerns. They're going to look at the atomization in today's society and say that that is not a good thing. There's breakdown of communities. There's lack of trust between individuals, lack of trust in social institutions. All of these things are bad, and they've fallen out of this prioritization of individual liberty and individualism in our society. Thus, to summarize, proponents of communitarianism, or community-based theory, think that liberal individualism provides an incorrect understanding of what it means to be human, what humans' shared moral and social obligations are, and it's going to say that liberalism provides an incorrect story for why suffering exists in Western society. Somebody who is a classical liberal or perhaps a conservative might say that the reason why some social groups aren't doing as well as others is because they're not working hard enough, they're making bad decisions, they need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. The communitarian is going to say, no, that's not actually the reason why certain social and racial groups are disadvantaged and suffering. It has to do with these wider social policies, this lack of communal prioritization. It's not that people aren't working hard or trying. It's that society, we have not set it up in order to benefit all people. Rather, we've set it up in order to help increase the wealth of a lucky few at the expense of all others. So, many communitarians are going to urge that we give up the, quote, principles, politics, and language of rights in favor of the principles, politics, and language of the common good. What community-based theory is going to be centered around is, how do we make everybody better off? How do we make social groups in society better? It's going to be more community-based, more collectivistic, less individualistic. In the rest of this chapter, the authors further distinguish communitarianism between two fundamental different kinds. There's what they call militant communitarianism and moderate communitarianism. Militant communitarianism tends to be hostile to rights, and it tends to perpetuate and impose on individuals certain values and ways of life. So, the militant communitarian is going to say, the problems that people in society face are so bad right now that we need to really clamp down on these ideas. Perhaps we need to change laws and regulations. We need to stop prioritizing individual rights so much, and we need to heavily incentivize people to take up the appropriate views so that we can all make society a safer, better place. So you might characterize militant communitarianism as being more authoritarian. They would like to see stronger controls and measures be created in order to steer society in the right direction towards social and economic progress. Moderate communitarians are a little bit less authoritarian. They are somewhat respectful to rights, and they're going to encourage that individuals follow certain values and ways of life, but they're not going to be so heavy-handed about it. So they're going to make arguments in favor of doing things differently or having different kinds of social and economic policy, but they're not going to be so heavy-handed about trying to fix things. They're going to recognize with the militant communitarians that, yeah, life would be better if we could get people to change their values and their goals and to get them to conceive of themselves as existing in wider society. But they're not going to be so much on board with, getting rid of people's rights or violating those rights in order to meet social goals, like the militants are. In sum, though, communitarianism is going to be about practicing what is good for the community. And this is true also of communitarianism's connection to the practice of medicine. Communitarianism is going to encourage individuals to think about how their actions and their ways of life impact their family, their neighborhood, their local community, their state, or even their country. There are a lot of different levels to this, and communitarians vary on what level they think we should be operating on. But in general, they're going to argue that instead of thinking about yourself and whether or not your rights are being violated, you should be thinking about how your actions are going to impact those around you. Are your actions steering society in the right direction? Are your actions helping others in society? Are they reducing inequality? Are they reducing inequity? Are they making things better off for people of other social groups and classes? Thus, communitarianism is going to argue that the community should take precedence over the individual. Spock's famous line in Star Trek comes to mind. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. That, I think, is a good encapsulation of what communitarianism is trying to say. They think that moving society in the right direction can be achieved by modifying our traditions, our norms, our values, and our practices. And we might be able to even move society in the right direction by modifying our language and how we analyze society. You may have heard phrases like health inequity, health disparities, those kinds of things. These phrases are intimately communitarian. If you ever hear about there being disparities, health disparities between different social groups, or inequities in public health between different social groups, what those phrases are trying to reveal to you is that if we look at particular communities in particular social groups, not everybody has the same access to health care, the same treatments, the same opportunities, etc. So what we're seeing today from a lot of progressive politics is this move to try to shift our focus away from individual rights to social concerns and systemic issues. We might say progressive politics today is much more communitarian and collectivistic than non-progressive political philosophy. Some communitarians also are going to say that we can change society for the better and we can make people a lot better off by changing laws and regulations. One of the specific examples that the authors bring up in this chapter is this move that has been occurring within the domain of organ transplantation. It used to be the case that it was an individual's choice whether or not to donate their organs after they died to somebody who might need them. But there's been a shift in recent decades to basically make it so that it is the family of the deceased who makes the decision as to whether or not their organs get to be donated. Here we are seeing a shift from individual decision-making to more community-based decision-making. Because we do recognize that there's a need for organs out there, and there are some people out there who believe that even though an individual does not want their organs to be donated after their death, there might be cases in which community need trumps the person's individual desires. So, to define this view, we could say the following. Community-based ethics, or communitarianism, is the view that the morality of an action is dependent on whether the action supports, sustains, and promotes the wider social community. And that's going to be dependent on whether or not you're talking about the family, your neighborhood, your racial group, etc. In general, this ethical theory is collectivistic as opposed to individualistic, like the liberal view. And we can say that this ethical theory is consequentialist as opposed to deontological or rights-based. See, according to Kant's view and according to liberal individualism, they both think that there is some objective and independent standard that we are all beholden to, and that this takes primary concerns over everything else, including the consequences of our own actions. Whereas the communitarian view is going to say, really what we should be focused on is how are our actions inside and outside the field of medicine impacting society? What kinds of consequences are our actions having? In this way, we might say that communitarian-based theory is more like utilitarianism. Both of these ethical views are going to be focused on consequences, and they're going to be focused on how our actions impact the wider community. It's not going to be so much focused on duties or the individual, but community and consequences. We are seeing today, I think, a shift away from liberal individualism to communitarianism or community-based theory, insofar as a lot of clinical settings now are discussing and prioritizing addressing health inequity, health disparity, etc. Some hospitals have even been experimenting with providing care to those of particular racial groups before others due to systemic and historical injustice. Of course, like every other ethical theory we've looked at, though, communitarianism also has its own weaknesses and its own problems. At the end of this chapter, the authors put forth the case that sometimes communitarianism presents a straw man of the values and analyses of liberal individualism. What they mean by that is sometimes communitarianism will not present what liberal individualism is saying in the proper and holistic way. They'll present a caricature of what liberal individualism actually says and then knock down that caricature. This is what is meant by putting up a straw man. Because the authors note, liberal individualism is going to say that there are values and considerations that we need to take into account that go beyond just the protection of individual rights. So it's not true that liberal individualism just cares about rights. It's just that they think that the safeguarding of those liberties should take priority. That's just one small example. The authors also worry that communitarianism may present us with a false dichotomy, that it's only possible for us to care for individual liberties or the public good. But it would seem that in a lot of instances, we can do both, right? We can protect somebody's individual rights while also looking out for the public good. So the authors worry that sometimes a false dichotomy is presented. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not the case that we can only care about individual rights or public health. Maybe there's a way that we can care about both and look out for both in a way that helps wider society and safeguards the individual from harm and coercion. Finally, and this is just the flip side of the last weakness of liberal individualism, we might say that respecting community wishes and goals shouldn't always take precedence over individual rights. One interesting example of this is in the short story Those Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin. In this story, a utopianistic society is presented where everybody is happy and everybody gets what they want and nobody is hungry or starves and everybody gets to relax and paint and have a good time. But it's revealed that in this magical world, in this magical society, everybody's happiness and flourishing depends on them locking up a child in a dark basement with no food, no clothing, no sunlight, and basically letting this child die. So the story asks us, if the suffering and torture and stunting of one child, if a utopia was based on that, would that be a justifiable scenario? I think a lot of people are kind of repulsed by this idea, and what that intuition I think reveals is that even if we could make wider society happier and better off than it would have been, sometimes it appears that individual rights and individual treatment should take precedence over wider society. It's not always obvious. There are some cases in which we might say wider society, the health of wider society should take precedence over individual rights, but it's not obvious in every case that that is true. There might be cases in which we should prioritize somebody's individual rights, even if violating them would make wider society happy. To just take one other example, consider the case that's often brought up, the hypothetical case in which somebody shows up to the doctor's office for their routine checkup and they're a perfectly healthy individual, and the doctor discovers that this healthy person who's shown up for their checkup is actually the perfect organ match for 5 people that he has in the back that are going to die at the end of the day unless they get an organ transplant. The question then becomes, is it right or good for the doctor to violate this healthy individual's rights, put him under, steal his organs, and save the 5 people at the expense of killing him? I think a lot of people might have problems with this, right? So this might be a case in which it's revealed that individual liberty should be respected, even if violating it is going to produce more social good. Okay, that about covers what I wanted to present for y'all today. We looked at the ethical theories of liberal individualism and communitarianism. Liberal individualism is going to argue that our top priority should be respecting people's individual rights. But, of course, we saw that there might be some problems with this, or concerns about maybe we want to look out for the community over some people's rights sometimes. Well, then we looked at communitarianism, or community-based theory. This view is basically the opposite of liberal individualism. It's going to say, if we're trying to figure out how to act, we should prioritize the concerns and considerations of our community over the individual. Of course, this view also has problems as well. The main point is this. Bioethics today, and this is a point I'm going to repeat ad nauseum, is an amalgamation of all these different ethical theories we've been looking at. It's informed by virtue theory, natural law theory, deontology, utilitarianism, liberal individualism, and communitarianism. And as we'll see, it's also informed by at least two other theories that we'll look at next time. So trying to figure out what we're supposed to do in a clinical setting, balancing all these different priorities and obligations, is very difficult. And it's not always obvious what a doctor or a care team should or shouldn't do for a patient. Nevertheless, we're going to think hard about this stuff, we're going to reflect, and we're going to try to see if we can come to some justified arguments. Okay. Thank you everyone for listening in. I will see you next time. Bye-bye.